everyone. Today is another episode of the Sava Wellness Community interview series. Sava Wellness is a business that provides wellness support to people with those with chronic illness and disabilities. My services include one-on-one virtual support meetings, so you can come if you have a chronic illness or disability and we can talk with each other. But you can also book me for a speaking engagement, and I like to bring awareness to chronic illness. And you can find all of these services on savawellness.ca to learn more about them. Now, today we have a wonderful guest. Today we have Alexis. Hello, Alexis. It's wonderful to talk with you today. Can you tell us a little bit
Hi.
about yourself?
My name's Alexis. I am a California girl through and through, born and raised. I am the oldest of three and the only girl. Um, what else about me? I am a Tahitian dancer and I recently got first place in a competition. I'm very proud of myself for that. I have a little puppy named Okoye who just recently turned 2. So I don't know if she's a puppy still technically, but yeah.
That's awesome. And don't worry, we're going to get back to the Tahitian dancing because I think that is incredible. But we're going to start a little bit more with about yourself and your chronic illness, just because that's more about the interview. But I can't wait to talk about your dancing. So stay tuned, everybody. Remember about that. Um, so the first question I have for you, Alexis, is do you have a diagnosis for your symptoms?
I do have a diagnosis. So the full thing is peripheral pulmonary artery branch stenosis, which led me to develop pulmonary hypertension. And that's just like one of the very fun, not so fun diagnoses that I have. I also have like an autoimmune like syndrome where like my body makes blood clots, and for me those blood clots are like in my lungs, so that's not fun either. But the main one that gives me the most gripe is the first one that I mentioned.
For people who don't know what that is, can you please, with whatever you're comfortable with, describe what that is?
I can't. Okay, so imagine your pulmonary arteries like like there's two branches, right? So imagine this is one and they branch off into smaller and smaller vessels. That's what a normal pulmonary artery looks like. But in my pulmonary arteries, you'll have like a nice branch like this and it'll branch off to other smaller things. But right here, it'll get really narrow, like to like this size. So when it's narrow like that, it limits how much blood flow gets to there. And in my condition, it like progressively narrows and narrows and narrows until it's like fully closed. And then you no longer have access to these vessels. And because you lose the access to those blood vessels, the blood pressure in here gets increased, which causes the right side of your heart to work harder than it should. So that's where pulmonary hypertension develops because of the narrowing. I
Okay.
hope that makes sense.
Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it doesn't sound very nice at all, though.
No, no. And it's not like I can feel it narrowing. I just happen to be born this way. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, Now, for people who don't know you very well, may I ask what you are wearing on your face?
Okay, so this is actually a really good question, because people ask me what this is. They say like nose tubes or tubes or whatever, but like the proper term is a nasal cannula, and I'm using it for oxygen because I have a long tail behind me. I just wear it this way because I think it looks better. But yeah, it's just oxygen.
Okay. And do you need to use oxygen because the vessels are smaller to your lungs?
So, yes. So to help with the narrowing, basically my whole life I would get this procedure done called an angioplasty, where they take a catheter through your femoral artery, up through your heart into the pulmonary arteries, and the doctor would find the narrow section, and on the catheter there's like a balloon, and he fills the balloon and it stretches the vessel open. Um, which you would think, okay, great, like you should be fine. But of course, because I'm super special, my vessels like don't stay open. So I would just have to have it done repeatedly. Where the oxygen comes in is while I was doing this procedure, probably when I was like 17 or 20 or something like that, my doctor noticed that when I was on oxygen, the pressures went down, because the oxygen is dilating the blood vessels. So at first, I started only sleeping with oxygen, but then my condition progressed. So now I wear it most of the time. I'll be honest, I don't wear oxygen all the time because sometimes it's very annoying. Um, but I wear it most of the time.
Thank you for explaining that. Now, you said that you were born with this. So did they find out right away, or some chronic illnesses come about like when you get a little bit older? Where was that for you?
For me, it was when I got a little bit older. Um, and it was like totally by a fluke, kind of. So I had broken out in hives, and my mom was working. She wasn't able to get the day off. So my dad took me to the doctor, and the doctor's like, oh, give her this for the hives. But I hear a heart murmur that I haven't heard on her before. I'm going to refer you to a cardiologist. It's probably nothing, but I just want I'm just being thorough. So we go to the cardiologist, which that appointment my mom went. And so we go. The doctor listens. I got an ultrasound in my heart, and the doctor comes back and they're like, oh, yeah, she has this huge hole in her heart. She needs open heart surgery to fix it. Which my mom like looked at my dad and she was like, you told me it was going to be nothing. And so I ended up having this is all happening when I was like 4 years old. So I had open heart surgery. I have a patch there now, and I was supposed to be normal after that,
Mm.
but I wasn't. And so for years after, I was short of breath. I would get tired way faster than the other kids my age, um, to the point of like passing out. Um, and so it kept happening, and my mom knew like that wasn't normal, obviously. So she would take me back and she would tell them what was going on. They would check the patch. The patch is fine. They would say everything is fine. She's probably just doing it for attention. And my mom's like, I know my kid. She doesn't do stuff like that for attention. She's not attention seeking. Um, and then finally, she took me in and she was like, I'm not leaving until you figure out what's wrong with her because I know something's wrong. And so the cardiologist listened to my heart, and he's like, oh, I hear a new murmur. And so they did a bunch of tests. Everything was coming back normal. And he was like, there's one more test we could do, but it's pretty invasive. Are you sure you want to go with it? Because everything else is telling us that it's fine. And my mom's like, I know it's not fine. Yeah, I want to do it. So that was when I was like 7 years old, and that's when they discovered the pulmonary artery stenosis with the pulmonary hypertension. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And did finally having that diagnosis? Okay.
I think for her it was validating because she was like, I told you that there was something wrong. At that time, I don't think we understood the weight of what the diagnosis was going to be. But for me personally, I think from that whole experience, I kind of developed like this, like I have to prove that something's wrong or something. Like I'm always worried like somebody's not going to believe me when I say something's wrong. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that with the experience you had. Like I would be that way too.
Yeah.
That's really difficult to, and I think nowadays it's called gaslighting, right? Like with lots of people talk about medical gaslighting, and it sucks that you've had that basically your whole life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one part of it was, it happened so young, and of course we changed care teams after that, and it's been pretty good since then. I've had little problems here and there. Um, but yeah, I don't know. And I think part of it is it happens so young that you just adapt to it and it's just like something normal. But yeah, I don't even know where I was going with that point. But
So, no, I got it. Yeah, like it just becomes a normal for you, and so people like trying to conceptualize what you're going through can't because they don't normalize it because they haven't had to do it. So I think that is
right.
a really good point.
Yeah.
But
I
so,
mean, I think another thing I get a lot of questions about is like, how do you deal with it? How do you cope with it? Or whatever. And I'm like, well, I've always been this way. So I know with some people, pulmonary hypertension, you can get it a multitude of ways. Some people, it's like later in life and they get pulmonary hypertension. And I see a lot of them like, well, I used to be able to do that, or I used to be able to do this. Like, how do you cope with that? And I'm like, well, I've always been this way. So I really don't have anything to compare it to because I've always not been normal. So I mean, I hate to say it, but I guess that's kind of the thing of it happening to you when you're younger. So,
mhm. Yeah, like you didn't have to cope with a whole diagnosis that completely changed your perspective, but you have had to cope with some things. Like, how did it start to feel when you wore an oxygen tank the whole time? Was that
right.
different for you, or?
Oh, that was extremely difficult for me because I think, which I actually wrote a post about this, and somebody was like, that's like a really profound point. But up until even when I was sleeping with oxygen, like it was still something I had at home, and I still had the ability to I guess I looked normal. And so I was able to disclose my condition to people who I wanted to, versus when I'm wearing oxygen all the time, I felt like I'm broadcasting like something's wrong, something that I in the past was able to, I guess, hide. Um, but that's probably like a little bit of internalized ableism. But like um, yeah, it was definitely like a huge struggle when I was put on it full time. Um, I literally stayed in the house for like a month. I remember getting home from the hospital and my mom was like, let's go to Disneyland. And I was like, yeah, no, I don't want to go to Disneyland. And she was like, oh, guys, like she's going through it. Um, and it just took a lot of time to have to like accepted, I guess. Because it's not that I didn't have like a supportive family and friends. I did. And they were always telling me like things, but it wasn't until I started believing those things myself that I actually started getting like more comfortable with it. But I would do a lot of dumb things because I would be so like embarrassed or like ashamed to have the oxygen, things that I like regret now. Um, but it just took a lot of time and a lot of like work on yourself. Because as much as it's nice to have people outside factors like validating you, it really doesn't count until like you actually believe it. You know, like I had a lot of my family like, oh, it doesn't really matter, like your oxygen, like it doesn't really matter, like everybody still sees you. And it wasn't until I actually started believing that, I saw like a difference in it. And it's also like, but I mean, I'm going to be perfectly honest. It's like an active thing. Like, it's not just like I got to some point and it could just be me, but it's not like I got to a point and I'm like, I'm good, I'm secure. I still have my moments where I'm like, self-conscious about it.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah. It took me some time. It didn't happen as fast as I would have liked. And part of it might have been because I got it so young at a point where maybe like I'm still figuring out myself. And then I got strapped with this and I was kind of like, what am I gonna do? So yeah.
Yeah, I think the person who said it was a really poignant point, I agree with. Until you, I think, can not necessarily accept, but start towards that accepting, I think it really does change your perspective. And like you said, that doesn't mean that every day is going to be perfect. Like you're not still going to be self-conscious about something about your illness or disability. But I like that you said that once you found you, that's when it really started.
Yeah.
And did that kind of bring like a different strength to yourself, did you find?
Um, would I say strength? I think I found like more, I would say more of like a confidence within myself.
Confidence. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, Alexis loves Disney. So the fact that she didn't want to go to Disneyland is massive.
Huge, massive, massive. Like that. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm pretty sure they had a whole family meeting without me. Like, you guys, she doesn't want to go to Disneyland. Like, so yeah. What that makes me think like my first big outing with oxygen was to Disneyland. And so I'm there and I've been using like mobility devices at the park since like forever. So, when you're little, you have a stroller. Then when you get a little bit bigger, you're in a wheelchair. And like as soon as I was old enough to drive a scooter, I was driving a scooter. So I'm like sitting in my scooter, and my mom has like the oxygen concentrator, and like mind you, I don't have it on. And she's like, "Dude, you have to put your oxygen on." And like I remember just sitting there, and I was like crying and emotional, and my uncle was there, and he's like, "Here, what if you wear my sunglasses?" And I was like, he's like, "Just try it, just trust me, just put your sunglasses on." And I'm telling you, like putting the sunglasses on, I don't know what it did, but it's like it gave me just like a little bit of distance, it felt like, between me and everybody else, where I was like, "Okay, I think I can do this." So that's kind of Disneyland. I guess that's like full circle. I didn't want to go, and when I finally went, and now I go all the time. So
That's great. I think it's so wonderful you had and you still do have a good support system. I think that
yeah.
always makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
It really does. And people like, I think that's a really big part of being somebody who's chronically ill slash disabled. Like, you'll be interested to find like people who you were close with, and then like let's say your condition changed, um, or like something happens. Like for me, it really kind of like shifted like who was really there and who's not. Um, and it really just helped me have like kind of refined to like the close circle that I have now. So yeah.
And this one's totally you don't have to answer, but if you're comfortable, I think a lot of people experience that when their illness changes or they get an illness, that a lot of people fall away. Um,
Yeah.
how did that make you feel? Like, how does that make you feel?
um at first it could be quite jarring, but I think for me, and first of all, like, yes, I am somebody who like posts stuff on the internet and all that jazz. So it's like kind of contradictory, but like I'm introverted, and I'm a person who only needs like a small like circle really. Um so for me it just helped like to refine it, but it did kind of hurt at like the beginning, or you'll find yourself in like certain situations, and to find like people who you thought were your friends, and they're not really accommodating to like what you want to do, or willing to change plans so that you're like able to go, or be able to participate. I mean, it hurts while it's happening, but like it's probably pushing you closer to those people who are like actually your people than not.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a tough one to explain to people when they're going through it because you're like,
Yeah.
you'll actually be better off, and they're like, no, I won't, and you're
Yeah.
like, you will,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that because I think a lot of people with chronic illness and disabilities go through that, but it's not something talked about because you don't want to talk about all the people that left you, right? Like, or
Right. I
that.
mean, because just being disabled and chronically ill can be isolating in itself. And so that can make people like, "What do you mean? I'm going to lose friends?" Like, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, like, yes, but those people really didn't care about you in the beginning. And like, are it wasn't as deep as a friendship as you thought. And the people who are really, really there, really rocking for you will like pull through, and you won't even think about like those other folks because you'll have your real ones with you.
Good point. Thank you for that. Um, how has your experiences of the world changed as your illness has changed?
Good God. Like, like literally, I mean, this kind of goes with it, but I was talking with my mom the other day. She's a nurse. Okay. And we were talking, and I was telling her, and I don't even know what made me say this, but I was like, you know what? Like, despite me living a very, like, very charmed life, like, I'm very privileged to have lived a really good life, raised by good people, all that jazz. I was like, but like, I still have a lot of trauma from being in the hospital all the time, like, as much as I was. Like, I don't think it's normal for like little kids to be comfortable in like ICUs. And I was like, and she was like, no, that's a valid point. She's like, get like, yeah, for sure. And I was like, whoa. Um, so like just like that, I mean, I think as a kid, you're pretty ignorant to things. Kids are mean. So you might get like picked on, but I think as I've gotten older and I've seen like the world, especially like with the pandemic that's gone on, um, how can I be like, well, I mean, I guess it's honest. Sometimes it's really hard to stay positive about like how society views us disabled folks. And sometimes it can be really discouraging and disappointing to see how people just so easily want to cast us off, I guess.
Mhm.
And even in like situations like in my life, I've gotten older. Um, and just like really odd things, like even I'll say like in the dating space, I think I wrote a post about like accepting my oxygen and like putting myself out there with oxygen if anybody would be interested, which that's a dumb post now because the real question is like, do I like you? Because it's really not if you like me, it's if I like, like I don't really care what some man thinks. It's more so like, what do I think about that man? Because men are. But anyway, uh, where was I going with this? But like I said, some posts and I was like talking about that, and like some guy was like, well, it really doesn't matter if you have an oxygen tank. All that matters is if you're able to have kids. If you're able to have kids, like I totally date you. And I was like, what an odd thing to say. I was like, well, I'm sorry, but like I don't equate somebody's ability to have kids with like their desirability and my value. Like to me, the two don't match up. So it's just like interactions like that, or even like at my job, I work in healthcare, and with the pandemic and COVID, I needed some modifications because like I'm obviously very vulnerable when it comes to that stuff. And just to see people like in my department, you know, that I thought were friends, like actually push back against those things. Um, so where am I going with this? Sometimes it can be really just tough and discouraging to see it, but like then on the flip side, you can find other people who are going through um you can find other people who have maybe your same condition. Like I have internet friends, I haven't met them yet. But we have the same condition and we really relate. And can share like experiences and maybe even like resources or whatever. Um, and also, I would say during the pandemic, I actually learned more about like the different disability advocates and like just how much change they've brought to the world. Um, like I think like without what is I can't this is so embarrassing. Is it the ADA? The ADA came in 1990, which I mean, I think that's huge. but that's also not that long ago because that's the year I was born. And then there's also like certain laws that apply to school, which without those disability advocates like making those laws, I mean, these people, what are they like? There's a good documentary. It's called Crip Camp. It is rated R, so if you're not old enough, ask your parents. But it's really good about sharing like history of ADA and this camp and all of these advocates that came out of this camp and just how much they changed the world for not only people with disabilities but like for everybody. Um so yeah, I'll say that. Um this is so all over the place. But what I will say is that after doing the work, reassuring myself, like finding my security, building my confidence, it's put me in a place where instead of like looking at the world and saying like, "Oh man, there's no um I don't see a lot of black disabled representation," instead of kind of like sitting and doing nothing, I feel like empowered like, well, maybe I can do something to change that, to advocate and raise awareness to that issue.
Was how has your experiences of the world changed since your illness has continued?
Um, so to start with, so I was born with this. So I think I've always been looking through the world with like a chronically ill point of view, like ever since I've been little. And I was telling my mom, like, the way that my brain works is that I'm always like, how can I get the most things done using the least amount of energy? um, so I think I've always kind of from that standpoint, I've always had kind of a different view on just how you move through everyday life as a chronically ill person. But as I've gotten older, I've my eyes have been opened and I can it's been kind of discouraging, but to see the amount of ableism that I see that exists in our society, especially with the pandemic and all the craziness that fell out because of that. And it can be like frustrating and just so incredibly discouraging. But on the flip side, I also see how there are people in situations like me who want to change that point of view and want to make our society more accessible. Because I think the biggest issue that I see is when somebody sees somebody who needs modifications, they think that like that means that they somehow want a shortcut or I don't know, like they want a shortcut or they want to take something from somebody else when really all a modification is that they want to be able to do the job as effectively as you, an able-bodied person. And so they just need a little boost or something to help them do that. Yeah, I mean, and it's really hard sometimes. I think as of late, sometimes I can get into this space and where I'm just like nobody really cares about disabled people um and it's kind of hard, but then I think doing research and looking up history of like disabled advocates and all the work that they have done for us, like with things like the ADA, which only came out in 1990, which isn't that long ago, folks, or other things that came along in schools that allowed like sick kids like myself to like be able to go to school and like or be able to miss school because we like have surgeries without like getting kicked out because schools used to be able to do that. Um, so like to think of all the work that they've done and just like funneling that into how I move. I don't know if I'm going to be changing any legislation, but I can see in my view of the world now that there has been a small effort to include disabled people. Um, and let's say like advertising and all of that jazz. But to me, it's a very specific view of disabled folks, and it oftentimes lacks disabled people of color. So I think like now my focus is on how can I raise awareness to that because I would like to be able to see somebody who looks like me in a Target ad, you know what I'm saying? So, yeah. I hope that makes sense.
It makes sense. And for those of you, like definitely at the end, I'll tell you how to follow Alexis. But she's already doing that. She gets paid sponsorships and she gets pictures of new clothing for Disney or stuff like this. And you're already changing, like not just advertising, but how people think because you are a person of color and you are disabled. And like you said, there's not targeted ads for people except that one very specific idea of disabled. And I think you're already doing massive work. And I think also you mentioned that you work in healthcare, and that's a very unique situation for people I've come across because if we work, it's not necessarily in healthcare. So would you like to talk a little bit about your job and what you do?
Sure. So I am a cardiac sonographer, or basically, I do ultrasounds of people's hearts. Um, and the reason why I got into it isn't actually as like complicated and as great as people think it is. It's really just at the clinic when I was growing up, where I got all of my echoes done. The whole team was like men. And so I was like, oh, there needs to be more women doing this because it was very awkward as like a teenager doing that. Um, but that just happened to be like isolated to my clinic. The field's mostly women, but that's like what sparked my interest. That's what I do. And I think it's a hard job for me. Like physically, it can be very taxing. But what I find rewarding is that on the occasion that I do get to bump into a patient who has a similar diagnosis with me, um, like not to build myself up so much, but when you first get that diagnosis of pulmonary hypertension and then you go to Google and you like see how it sucks, basically, can I say that? I'd like to be a source for them to be like, you know what, like, yes, that sounds very scary, but there are people like us who are out here like living life, and you can like continue to live your life too.
Mhm. Oh, that's wonderful. I think that's so great. Um, can you tell us which of your symptoms you find the most debilitating and why?
Oh, um so my whole one of my big ones is shortness of breath. But there's a thing that I've been doing ever since I've been little, which I think the term is like self-limiting. So I'm pretty good at like managing that. But I think what's been kicking my butt as I've gotten older is the chronic fatigue. Um, and I like can really beat myself up to like about it because I'm still, which you would think as long as I have it, I wouldn't do this. But yeah, I still compare myself to like what everybody else is doing. Sometimes I compare myself to like my other friends who have the same condition, and I'm just like, man, it just seems like they're doing so much and I'm just here tired. So I think like that can be probably the hardest one to deal with for me.
Yeah, the chronic fatigue's a tough one. It
Yeah.
affects people in different ways, but I have tend myself and people I've interviewed, you feel lazy and you're not. Like you physically cannot get up and go, right? So
Yeah. Cause
yeah.
that's something that I've actually like battled with because I'm like, oh, am I lazy? But then I'm like, my mom's like, no, you're not lazy. You just have chronic fatigue.
Yeah. Yeah, my mom does that to me too. So, um, so if you're comfortable, can you describe what a bad symptom-wise day looks like to you?
A bad symptom day for me is like it's when the chronic fatigue is just really has taken over my day. I try to prevent it by limiting how much like stuff that I do like in the days before. But sometimes if I'm like burning the light at both ends and I've done the absolute most, it's gonna kick me in the butt. And usually those days I'm literally just like in bed all day. I usually know it's gonna happen the day before because the night that I go to sleep, my joints will ache, and I'm gonna be like, oh, tomorrow we're not doing anything. So I lay in bed. I probably like DoorDash food even. It's just a day in the bed, for me. Um, and then sometimes I'll actually like schedule like pajama days, to kind of like recharge the battery or like try to build up some spoons. But I can't, I just can't explain it. Like usually it's just days where I'm just in the bed and I'll have like the desire to want to do stuff. And then I'm just like, yeah, that's not happening today. So yeah.
I think that's always a tough one, right? To have the desire to do things, but no, you can't.
Yes.
It's a tough one to learn to accept and like tell your body, I'm listening. We're just gonna lay here. Like, yeah, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
tough.
It is. And it's hard. I think it's hard for me to explain to other people. So like at my job, I am on call. So I don't have like a set schedule or anything, which works for me because I can say no when I am not feeling well. Um, so, I have other coworkers and they're like, Alexis, like, how come you haven't like taken a full-time position, or how come you don't want to work any more hours? And I have to like explain, I'm like, because physically, like, let's say I did want to work full time, all the energy that I would have to do would be to work and do nothing else. And I know as far as like my mental health, that wouldn't work. That's not sustainable for me. So I'd rather work less hours so that I have more time to do some of my other things that I really like to do in life. But I also need to like schedule rest.
Mhm.
Um, like that's something that's really important for my body, I know. So I mean, it can be hard. Some people get it and some people don't, but um that's just what I have to do. And then some days like I can just be experiencing side effects from my medication sometimes, which can just be really unfortunate, and that just means that I'm going to be laid up anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And on the flip side, when you have a good symptom day, what do you like to do?
So I'm going to be perfectly honest. I have just been, usually I'm very like organized. I have a planner, I do all of that. I haven't touched my planner in months, but typically on a good symptom day, I would have planned, and it doesn't sound, well, I'm not going to tell myself that. Actually, I'm going to check that behavior right now. Usually I give myself like three big things to do, like on my list, and then I have things at home that I need to do. um, and it kind of depends what the day is. If it's a day that I have dance class, I try to limit it to like two big things because I want to reserve as much energy as I can
Mhm.
for dance. But if I don't have to go to work, like I sleep in, which I also used to beat myself up for that. But somebody was like, why are you apologizing for sleeping in on your day off? Like, who does that? And I'm like, valid point. Yeah. So I like take my time. I have a pretty leisurely morning unless I have some appointments or whatever. Um and I'm just going and I'm doing the things that I need to get done, which
Mhm.
sounds boring.
Mhm.
Um if it's a like particularly chill day, I might like treat myself to lunch, or one of my things is I like to go to the movies by myself. Um so I might do that. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's also important to know is a lot of us have like three things on our list we want to do. And we always feel like we need to do more or that we don't get enough, or sleeping in is not productive in our mind.
Right.
And I think that you mentioned it earlier, is like that internalized ableism. I think that we have is like, no, we're allowed to sleep in. Like, if we get one thing done today, that's amazing,
Yeah.
right? So I thank you for sharing that, because I think for people who don't have chronic illness and for people who do, it's really important to hear that that's okay. Like, it really is okay.
Yeah. And even like on days where I'm feeling really good and I've done my three things and I'm kind of like, oh, you could do this one last thing. But I'm like, no, three is our good number. Because if you do 4, then what if you use up all your spoons for tomorrow and then tomorrow you're just laid up?
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's always that planning, right? Like,
Yeah.
yes, can I do that tomorrow? And if I did that yesterday, can I do this today? Yeah, totally. Yeah. What has been helpful for you as you've gone through this journey?
Um, I think a really good has been extremely helpful is like therapy.
Mm,
Um, and I think my mom put me in therapy even as a kid, like off and on. But and then I kind of stopped and then I got back into it. I find that to be really beneficial, especially if you hopefully have a therapist that you really like.
mm,
I really like that. I think that's been super beneficial. I'm also very fortunate to have a supportive um, family um, too, who's pretty good. And then I also have like my supportive friends and all of that.
mm.
So
Yeah.
I think
That
that's what's been like super helpful.
yeah. Yeah, and I know I keep thanking you, but really thank you for talking about having a therapist. I think that's still very stigmatized.
Right.
I think people are like, "Well, why do you need to go to therapy?" Like, you don't need it to talk about your sickness, and you're like, "Well, actually, I do."
Well, I think for me personally, which I've mentioned this to like my care team, I was like, I think like therapy should be like a part, like a mandatory like part of like one's treatment. But I've definitely had people who have said that to me, like, because I go through depressive episodes, and I think so. I told somebody that like, "Oh, yeah, like, I definitely go through the saddies," and they're like, "You go through the saddies?" And I'm like, "I have a chronic illness that doesn't have a cure that will probably lead to my premature death. You don't think I have any feelings about that at all?" So, yeah, I think therapy is beneficial for everybody, even if you don't have a chronic illness, but I think for those of us who have chronic illnesses, it can be a very isolating experience, especially when we live in a world that doesn't always want to accommodate us. I think it's nice to not only have that like sounding board, an unbiased sounding board that you can talk to, but also I think with my therapist, and just the way my personality is set up, I'm very hard on myself. I can beat myself up. I'm a perfectionist and all that. So it's nice for her to kind of check me and be like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. What are you doing, Alexis? Why are you talking to yourself like that? So, yeah, I think therapy is great. And I'm not talking about talking to your friend. I mean, like an actual, like, therapist, which they're hard to find. And I know people don't have, not everybody has the resources and access to it. But if you do, like, check it out.
Yes. Yes, that was good. Um, is there anything you'd like people to know about your chronic illness or chronic illness in general?
I think like the biggest thing, which I was actually looking through my phone and I had this like screenshot of this IG graphic. And it was like a disabled person could look like this, and it was like a person in a wheelchair, and then another person who just looked like a regular, ordinary person. I think like that's my biggest takeaway. Um, that like chronic illness and disability, there is no one look. It literally anybody in the population at in any point in their life can become a part of like the disabled community. That's like the only minority group where like anybody could be a part of it at any time. And I think like that's my biggest takeaway from it. And also for like those of us within the community, like, don't necessarily compare yourself to others in the community. I feel like also another note, which I'm really just spitballing here, is there's different ways to also advocate for one's community. I was having a conversation with another friend who has the same condition, and I was like, you know what? I'm a really bad advocate. Like, I haven't talked about pulmonary hypertension on my page for months. Um, like, I don't even think I should call myself an advocate. And then she's like, well, there's more than one way to advocate, right? And she's like you just living your life publicly with your oxygen, like, I would consider that a form of advocacy. And I was like, huh, that might be a point there. So I think that's my last 2 cents, that there's more than one way to advocate for your condition, or just like being a chronically ill person as a whole. Like, I feel like you just existing could be a form of advocacy, because for some reason, um, society likes to think that like chronically ill people and disabled people, that like we don't do anything, or we must all just be kind of locked up in our houses or something, when literally like disabled people and chronically ill folks, they're like some of the most like creative, innovative, funny, like, they're a great pot of people. They just function a little differently than everybody else.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And now I think we've kept everyone waiting long enough. So, Alexis, would you like to tell us about your dancing, please?
Oh, yes. So I am a Tahitian dancer. I actually started dancing hula and Tahitian. Um, and it's something that I just had always had an interest in learning how to do, because it always just looked so pretty to me. And I finally found a class that like fit in my schedule. It was actually my first class happened like the first week of my echo program. And my professor was like, okay, this is day one. First thing, don't pick up any new hobbies. Don't start learning any new languages. Don't start learning any new dances. And I was like, whoops. Um, but I'm so happy that I just like went through it, because it started out as kind of like an interest, kind of like a hobby for me, but it's really grown into a passion of mine. And actually, dance has really helped me to, was also a really big part in helping me to embrace my oxygen tank. Because, like, for the first, I would say, 9 months of learning, I never wore my oxygen, which was probably a really stupid idea. But I was just really worried, because I'm like, I'm already not Polynesian. So I don't want to stick out any further by also having an oxygen tank. So it wasn't until I was getting ready for my very first like showcase with my old group, that I kind of like sat down with my teachers and I was like, yeah, so I wear oxygen. And I should have been bringing it to class, but I was too nervous to put it on. And they're like, girl, what were you doing? Like we don't care. Like, we care, but we really don't care about that. Like, do what you need to do to be able to dance. Um, so yeah, it was like a really big part. And one of my hula sisters actually like kind of modified this backpack for me to put my oxygen tank in, which her name is Stella the Tank, kind of like Megan the Stallion. And so she modified this backpack so I could have it for dance competitions. Um, and so yeah, I started dancing in like 2016. Then I changed groups to dance Tahitian dance exclusively. I love hula, don't get me wrong. I love hula. I actually think I'm a better hula dancer than Tahitian dancer. But Tahitian just really pushes me outside of my comfort zone. And I feel like it's just because of that constant push, it just really helped me to develop as who I am. So I'm really excited. Like, I've been doing competitions probably since I first started dancing, but just recently I did a local competition here and I got first place. And like, still in shock. Like, I'm very proud of myself, but I'm like still in shock, because never in my like wildest dreams ever would I ever think that like I could get first place, especially like knowing full well that like I just can't physically keep up with everybody, because like I have limitations. So the fact that like I got first place was just like beyond. So that's me and Tahitian dance in a nutshell. Oh, last summer I got to go to Tahiti with my dance group. We got invited by the government. We participated in a festival. So many like bucket list dance things I got to check off this year. And I was after that last competition, I kind of was like talking to my mom, I'm like, so I think that means I should go ahead and retire while I'm up on top. And she was like, oh, hold on a minute. I think you still got some years left in you. So yeah.
And you and your group did really well in Tahiti too, didn't you?
Uh, you know, we did really well. I think like the Tahitians were really appreciative of our dance. It wasn't a competition per se.
Oh,
We did do a competition before we went to Tahiti, and we did well in that. Though I will say that.
good.
So, yeah.
Can you please tell us how people can follow you to see your dancing and your Disney and you just being your amazing you?
So you can follow me on Instagram at Take a Breath with Alexis. I also have a YouTube channel that I haven't updated in a while, but I want to dip back into that again. And it's the same thing. Take a Breath with Alexis. You can also find me on TikTok at Take a Breath with Alexis. I have a Twitter. I don't use it though. I'm just on there to laugh. So yeah. But those are the main spots where you can keep up with me.
Great, that's so wonderful. Thank you so much for being my interviewee this month. It has been incredible, and you are amazing and are an inspiration. So thank you so much, Alexis.
Thank you so much for having me. For y'all watching, Sarah has literally been like trying to get me nailed down for the longest. And I was like, she's going to be like, you know what? I'm going to move on because Alexis is literally like all over the place, as you can tell by this interview. So I'm so happy that like the moon and sun aligned where we were finally able to get this done. So I'm really happy and honored that I was able to do this with Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much.